So last week, if you remember, we talked about adding and subtracting with positive and negative integers, which are positive and negative whole numbers. And I promised you that we would start looking at all of the rational numbers and we would learn how to add with positive and negative rational numbers. So now you need to remember rational numbers are going to look like fractions or decimals or whole numbers, and they can either be positive or negative. Okay, and the reason why these forms of numbers can be called rational numbers is because we can convert them to fraction form a over b. So we have some number a in the numerator over some number b in the denominator, and b can never be equal to 0. Okay, and that was how we defined rational numbers. So rational numbers are all types of numbers. They can look like positive and negative fractions. They can look like positive and negative decimals, or they can be positive and negative whole numbers. Okay, so that was one of the first things that we learned last week. Then we specifically talked about adding and subtracting positive integers, positive and negative whole numbers or integers. And the first thing that we learned was how to create a t-table, a t-chart that would help us to take the lyrics from a song that you probably learned last year, take the lyrics from the song and put them in this chart to help us to remember the steps to add. Now, one thing that I want to point out to you so that you understand, so let's look at this real quick. Can you see what math operation this makes when we highlight the t-chart? That looks like a plus sign, right? So that means that the t-chart is for adding positive and negative numbers. So when we have addition of positive and negative numbers, we're going to think of this plus sign, and we know that we need to use the t-chart in order to solve. Okay, now the second thing we learned was how to subtract positive and negative whole numbers or integers. And we learned that subtracting is really the same thing as adding the opposite. So we came up with our nonsense word and we called it S-A-O, and we called it SAO, and that was our subtraction strategy. Now, our subtraction strategy, it begins with the letter S. Each one of these is a step that we take in the solution to finding the correct answer. So since this begins with S, we can think of this as also subtraction. And we know that S stands for subtraction, and then these are the individual steps. So each letter represents a word, and it tells me what I need to do when I'm subtracting. So we're going to take S for same, A for add, and O for opposite. Now you want to remember, if you put the S above the first number, and then you put the A around the minus sign, and then you put the O, or a line, around the O, you create these little bubbles. And inside these little bubbles right here, that letters tell me the step and what I have to do to the number or the math sign inside the bubble. So for this one, we know that S stands for same. So we're going to leave that number the same. So 5 stays as 5. Then we have the next letter or the next step, which is add. So instead of subtract, we're going to change this to addition. So the subtraction sign becomes an addition sign. And then the last step tells me what to do with the number in the bubble, and it says opposite. So that means I have to take the opposite of the number underneath it inside this little bubble. So the opposite of 7, if this sign is positive, the opposite has to be negative. So the opposite of positive 7 is negative 7. So we change this 7 to a negative 7. And now what we have here, sorry about that. Now what we have here is we have this plus sign right here. And now we are adding, so we need to use the T-chart, because remember, the T-chart tells me to what? Tells me the rules for adding, because I have this big plus sign in the T-chart. And then we would solve, okay? Now, I'm not going to do that problem. Those were just the steps. So today, instead of talking about whole numbers, we're going to talk about adding and subtracting with decimals, okay? Now, the great news here is we get to use the same rules. So when we learned how to add and subtract positive and negative integers last week, we used the T-chart, and then we used our SAO or our SAO strategy for subtraction. We get to use those same techniques to solve when we're doing adding and subtracting with decimals. However, the biggest key you have to remember is this right here. Whenever you're using decimals, adding and subtracting decimals, you have to make sure that the decimal points are lined up. So for example, if I had the number 17.1 and I wanted to add 3.57, I would need to add that up with the decimal points right above and below each other. So I'm going to look for the larger number here, and that's where I'm going to start. This is the larger number. So I'm going to take 17.1, and then I'm going to take 3.57, and I'm going to put my decimal point here, and now I'm going to build this number around that decimal point. So the 3 is in the ones place value, the 5 is in the tenths place value, and the 7 is in the hundredths place value. Now I have an empty spot here, so I have to put a 0 for a placeholder, and now I can add the two numbers together. I'm trying to find red. There's red. Okay, so we can add them together, and 0 plus 7 is 7. 1 plus 5 is 6. My decimal point comes straight down into my answer. And then 7 plus 3 is 20. Excuse me, 7 plus 3 is 10. I carry the 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So we have to remember that we line up the decimal points. If I did this, if I did 17.1 and then I did 3.57, that would not be correct because my decimal points are not above and below each other. So this is the wrong way to do this. my decimal point has to be above each other. So see how they're straight up and down, and then my answer is right below it. Okay, so let's look at an example of how we would actually add with a positive and a negative integer. So in this case, we're going to notice that my operation is addition. So since this is addition, remember, when we add, we want to use the T-chart because the plus sign in the middle of the T-chart tells me that I need to use it when I add. So we're going to use the T-chart. So you should always write your T-chart down, and we're going to say T-chart, there's my plus sign for adding, so write it down. So we sing the song. Same sign, add, different sign, subtract. Whoops, sorry about that. Subtract. Whoa, let's back that up a bit. Sorry about that. I got that all wrong, don't I, guys? Let's see. Let's erase that. It's same sign. Okay, let's start over. Sorry. Okay, so let's start over. Okay, so we're going to do our plus sign for the T-chart. So we have the T-chart, and we have what? We have same on this side. So are the signs same or are they different? And then we sing the song. Same sign, add, different sign, subtract, same sign, keep the sign, different, keep the larger. So that's what we need in order to do addition. Because remember, the T-chart tells me what math operation. And I got this big plus sign right here. So that means adding. Okay. So what we want to do is we then want to ask ourselves, okay, do they have the same sign or different sign? So I come over here and we notice this is negative and this is positive, okay? So we know that we're going to use the column in our T-chart that says different. So we're going to be working down this way. Those are the steps, okay? So we're going to come back up here. So what we have to do is we have to make sure we line up the decimal points. And the easiest way to do that is to put the greatest absolute value up top. In other words, get rid of all the positive and negative signs and just look at the numbers. So in this case, we have the absolute value of 268.9. This should actually say negative, is greater than 38, the absolute value of 38.65. So just look at the approximation. This is about 270 and this is about 39. So we know this number is definitely greater than the other number. So we want that number to go on top. So we're going to go 268.9. And then we're going to take the second number and we're going to line up the decimal points. And now we can put our place values in with our numbers. So we have 10's place value, 1's place value, 10th place value, 100's place value. And then I have to do what? We need to put a placeholder here because we have something missing. So now we're going back up here. We have different signs and we're following this part of the table. Different signs subtract. So we need to subtract these two numbers. 0 minus 5. Can I do that? Nope. I can't take something away from nothing. So I have to go next door and I have to regroup. And then I have to make this 10. And now 10 minus 5 is 5. 8 minus 6 is 2. Bring my decimal point down. 8 minus 8 is 0. 6 minus 3 is 3. And then 2 minus nothing is 2. Now, I did this step, I subtracted, but now I have to do this step. I have to keep the sign of the larger number. Which one is the larger number? Well, we know that we put the greatest absolute value up top here, so that means this number right here is the larger number. It has a negative sign, so I keep the negative sign in my final answer. So now you want to remember, okay? You need to ask yourselves, are we adding or subtracting? If we're adding, we can use the T-chart. And remember what I showed you. The T is a big plus sign, okay? And if we're subtracting, that word begins with S. This word begins with S. So if we're subtracting, we want to use the SAO process. So the first step, we keep the first number the same, then we change to addition, and then we change to the opposite. Now you have an addition problem, and now you use the T-chart to solve. Okay, so let's look at a couple of problems just to give you some guided practice. Okay, first thing you should do is write your T-chart down. So let's write our T-chart down. Remember, this is addition. This tells me what to do for addition. So we have same sign, add, different sign, subtract. I'm going to abbreviate. Subtract. Same sign, keep the sign. Different, keep the larger. So let's take a look at this problem down here because it's subtraction. Now remember, subtraction begins with the letter S, and our subtraction strategy also begins with the letter S, and we want to do SAO for the steps that we have to take. So what are we going to do here? We're going to take the first number and we're going to leave it the same. Because remember, this is subtracting. This begins with S, so we're going to use the SAO. S, that stays the same. Now, it's important that you rewrite this. It's important that you rewrite it this way. So adding subtracting becomes adding. And then we take the opposite of this number right here. The O tells me take the opposite. So the opposite of positive 1.06 is, oops, I gotta make that negative. So let me give myself some room here. Let's see if I can do it real quick. So this has to be negative 1.06. And we're adding them together. Now I can forget about this. I want to look at this new rewritten problem. And now we see that we're adding. So we come back up to the T-chart because we're adding. Remember, the plus sign in the middle of the T-chart tells me I'm adding. So now I need to find out, are my numbers the same sign or different sign? This one's negative, this one's negative. So that means we're looking at this side of the table because they have the same signs. So it tells me to add, so we're going to do 1.8 plus 1.06, and we're going to add, I'm going to put a placeholder, 0 and 6 is 6, 8 and 0 is 8, 1 and 1 is 2, and I'm going to put the decimal point straight down, and then my answer, I'm going to keep the same sign, and the sign is negative, so my answer is 2.86 because these two are negative. Okay, so let's look at another problem real quick. And I'm going real slow so that you understand, so I apologize. But let's look at this one right here. So we have 8.24 plus negative 17.6. So what math operation do we have? We have adding, so we're going to use the t-table again. And what am I going to do? I have to ask myself, what side of the table do I use? Well, we got to figure out, are they the same signs or different signs? This one is positive, this one is negative, so that means we're going to use this side of the t-table. So we're going to take the larger number. So get rid of the signs and we're going to put them vertically. So we're going to say 17.6 and the smaller number 8 and put that decimal point right below 8.24. I have to put a placeholder in because there's nothing here. So I'm going to put a placeholder there. And then my table tells me I'm going to subtract and then keep the sign of the larger number. So we're going to come down here. We're going to subtract 0 minus 4. 0 minus 4. I can't do that. I have to borrow. Oops, sorry about that. I have to borrow. So this, oh goodness, hold on. This becomes 5. And then I regroup and this becomes 10. 10 minus 4 is 6. 5 minus 2 is 3. And then I bring the decimal point down. And then we have, now look at this. This is really just 17 minus 8. I don't have to regroup here. I can just say 17 minus 8 equals 9. But I've got to keep the sign of the number that's the largest. Well, 17.6 is up top, so that's the largest number, and it's negative, so my answer has to be negative 9.36. And that would be my answer. Okay. Now, what I would like for you to do is to do the homework assignment, and you can just type in your answers. Use the techniques that I've given you, okay? Even though you're working at home, it's important that you do what is asked to do. Draw your T-chart and show your work, okay? Let's draw the T-chart. We use the T-chart for adding because there's a big plus sign in the middle. We say same sign, add, different signs, subtract, different, subtract, same sign, keep the sign, different, keep the larger. Okay, now remember, we're going to use that when we are adding because we have this big plus sign in the middle of our T-chart. So that means add. Now, if we look at a problem like this one, we notice right away that this is subtraction. So subtraction begins with an S, so that means we want to use the strategy that begins with the letter S. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the letters from our strategy and we're going to write it over top of the problem itself. And we're going to say S for same, A for add, O for opposite. We leave the first number the same, so that stays 5.8. And instead of subtract, we're going to add. So we change the sign to an addition sign. And then we change this number to its opposite. The opposite of 10.9 is negative 10.9. And now we have an addition problem. So we're going to use the T-chart to solve. So it's always a good idea to write your SAO over top of your, oops, sorry about that, over top of your subtraction problems. So there's a subtraction problem there, and there's a subtraction problem here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write my steps right above it, SAO. This is an addition problem. This is a subtraction problem. Since it's subtraction, subtraction begins with S, so I'm going to use my nonsense word, SAO, and I'm going to write those steps over top of each part of the problem, and I'm going to solve. So remember, we keep the first number the same. We change subtract to add. And then we change the next number to its opposite. The opposite of a positive number is a negative number, so this becomes negative 41.9. Now we have an addition problem. We have an addition problem, and we can use the T-chart to solve. Okay, that was a pretty lengthy explanation, but I went really, really slow so that you could see everything in detail. Now I want you to do is finish the other problems. I got you started on 3 of them, so you need to finish the rest. And thank you very much.